There is a version of your life you imagined when you were younger. Maybe it involved a certain kind of freedom, waking up without an alarm, spending money without anxiety, making choices based on what you wanted rather than what you could afford. Most people still carry that version somewhere inside them, and yet decades into a career, they find themselves financially stuck in roughly the same place they started, just with more expenses, more obligations, and a quieter desperation they've learned not to talk about. This isn't a story about laziness. The people this is about are not lazy. They wake up early. They stay late. They sacrifice weekends. They do what's asked of them, often more, and still, wealth, real wealth, the kind that creates freedom, never seems to arrive. The raises come, the promotions come, and yet the feeling of financial constraint never fully lifts. It just changes shape. What if the reason isn't effort? What if the reason isn't even money? What if the reason is fear, so deeply embedded in the structure of employment that most people can't see it operating inside them at all? When someone accepts a job, the transaction looks simple on the surface. Time exchanged for money, skills exchanged for compensation. It seems like a rational economic agreement between two parties, but underneath that surface, something else is being exchanged, something that doesn't appear in any contract. The employee is exchanging psychological certainty for financial certainty. They are trading the anxiety of the unknown for the comfort of a predictable number arriving on a predictable date. And in the beginning, that trade feels reasonable, even smart, because uncertainty is genuinely uncomfortable, not knowing where next month's income comes from produces real anxiety. So when an employer offers to remove that anxiety in exchange for your time, your mind interprets it as a form of safety. But here's what that trade actually costs. And this is the part nobody explains clearly. When you outsource financial uncertainty to an employer, you don't just remove the anxiety. You remove the psychological machinery required to function without certainty. You stop developing tolerance for financial ambiguity. You stop building the mental muscles required to take financial risk. You become, over time, someone who genuinely cannot operate comfortably outside the predictable income structure, not because you lack intelligence or ambition, but because your nervous system has been conditioned to require it. This is not a metaphor. This is neurological. The brain structures that govern risk assessment, particularly the amygdala, become calibrated to treat financial unpredictability as a threat signal. The longer someone lives within a predictable income structure, the more intensely their nervous system reacts to the idea of leaving it. What begins as a practical choice slowly becomes a psychological cage, one with invisible bars. Think about what a salary actually does to a person's relationship with money. When income arrives, on a fixed schedule and a fixed amount, money loses its connection to the decisions and actions that produced it. You don't experience the direct feedback loop between a specific risk you took and a specific reward you received. You experience the same reward regardless of how much initiative you showed, regardless of how much value you created, regardless of what you did or didn't do that month. The reward is decoupled from the behavior. For children, psychologists know that decoupled rewards produce a very specific kind of learned helplessness. When rewards arrive regardless of action, the child stops connecting effort to outcome. They stop believing their choices change their circumstances. They begin to perceive their situation as something that happens to them rather than something they shape. Adults in salary structures experience a version of the same conditioning, slowly, over years, so gradually they never notice it happening. The monthly paycheck arrives. The effort to reward feedback loop is severed. The mind begins to unconsciously interpret its financial reality as something that is managed from the outside rather than created from the inside. And here is the crucial consequence of that conditioning. When an opportunity appears, a business idea, an investment, a risk that could compound into something real, the salary-conditioned mind doesn't evaluate it as an opportunity. It evaluates it as a threat to the predictable system. It sees the disruption before it sees the potential. It calculates what could go wrong before it calculates what could go right. Not because the person is irrational, but because their entire financial psychology has been trained to protect the existing income structure above everything else. Wealth doesn't accumulate inside that mindset. It can't, because wealth requires a fundamentally different relationship with uncertainty, one that treats financial ambiguity not as a threat, but as the terrain on which opportunity lives. There is something almost invisible happening in the middle-class financial experience that deserves slow, careful examination. Because it's one of the most psychologically sophisticated traps in modern economic life, and it's designed, whether intentionally or not, to feel exactly like progress. It begins with the first raise. When income increases, expenses typically increase with it. This is well documented. Economists call it lifestyle inflation. But the psychological mechanism underneath lifestyle inflation is less often discussed. When income rises, the mind interprets the new spending level as the new baseline. The expanded apartment, the newer car, the more expensive habits. These stop feeling like luxuries within months and start feeling like necessities. The psychological floor rises. What this means is that the gap between income and expenses, the only gap from which wealth can actually be built, frequently stays narrow even as the salary grows larger. The person feels financially successful because the numbers are bigger. But the actual structure of their financial life, the ratio of what they keep versus what they spend, often doesn't change significantly. They are running faster on the same treadmill. And because the motion feels like progress, because the number on the paycheck is genuinely larger than it was 5 years ago, the illusion of advancement is convincing. Only when they stop and calculate their actual net worth, only when they ask themselves how many months they could survive if the salary stopped tomorrow, does the real picture emerge. Most people avoid that calculation, not because they're stupid, because the answer is frightening, and the brain is extraordinarily good at protecting people from frightening truths about their own situation. So the calculation doesn't get made. The comfortable illusion persists, and the years accumulate inside it. Now here is where the psychology gets darker, and more important. Fear in financial life doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a label. It arrives wearing the costume of wisdom. It sounds like practicality. It sounds like responsibility. It sounds like the voice of someone who has seen how things go wrong and has learned to be careful. It's the internal voice that says, "This isn't the right time. The economy is uncertain. I should wait until I have more savings. This opportunity seems too risky." Every one of those thoughts can be genuinely wise in the right context, but in the financial lives of most employed people, they function as permanent delay mechanisms. The right time never comes. The savings never feel sufficient. The opportunity always carries some risk that feels like a good reason to wait, and so nothing changes. This is fear operating at its most sophisticated level, not as panic, not as paralysis you can recognize and fight against, but as perpetual, rational-sounding postponement. The person is not frozen. They are moving. They are working hard, saving a little, making sensible decisions, but they are moving in a circle. The sensible decisions are always decisions that preserve the existing structure and defer the risk that could break them out of it. What makes this particularly insidious is that the employed environment actively validates this fear. Employers don't benefit from employees who are mentally oriented toward leaving. The entire structure of corporate employment rewards loyalty, continuity, and predictability. Promotions go to those who demonstrate long-term commitment. Security is offered as the reward for staying. The message embedded in the system, never spoken explicitly but communicated constantly, is that stability is virtue and departure is risk. Spend enough years inside that system and you don't just behave as if stability is virtue. You believe it becomes part of your identity. Leaving feels not just financially dangerous but morally wrong, like a betrayal of your own responsible nature. The fear doesn't feel like fear anymore, it feels like character. There is a concept in developmental psychology called secure attachment, the idea that children who feel safely bonded to a caregiver develop the psychological confidence to explore their environment, take risks, and return to the caregiver as a safe base when things go wrong. Children without secure attachment often develop hypervigilance. They become intensely focused on maintaining proximity to whatever source of safety exists in their environment because the psychological cost of losing that source feels existentially threatening. The relationship between an employee and their employer, particularly over time, begins to function like an attachment relationship. The salary is the safe base. The job title is the identity anchor. The company becomes the structure that organizes daily life, social relationships, even self-worth. And just as in insecure attachment, the prospect of losing that safe base produces a fear response that is disproportionate to the actual material threat. This is why people stay in jobs they've hated for years. This is why intelligent, capable people find themselves unable to quit despite having marketable skills, savings, and perfectly viable alternatives. The decision isn't being made by the rational, calculating part of the mind. It's being made by the part that learned over years of conditioning that this salary, this employer, this structure is safety itself. And the survival-oriented mind does not let go of safety easily. Understanding this doesn't make the fear disappear, but it does reveal something important. The inability to leave employment, the inability to take financial risk, the inability to make the kinds of decisions that produce real wealth. These are not character flaws. They are the predictable, psychological outputs of a very specific kind of conditioning. They are what a person becomes when their financial psychology has been shaped by years of structured dependency. Let's talk about the concept of ownership, because it sits at the center of why wealth concentrates where it does, and it almost never gets discussed in terms of what it actually requires psychologically. Wealthy people, almost universally, own things that generate income without requiring their continuous labor. They own businesses, equity, property, assets that produce returns while they sleep. This is not a secret. Every financially literate person knows this. It's discussed endlessly in books, podcasts, financial media. And yet the vast majority of people who know this intellectually do not act on it. The knowledge exists. The behavior doesn't follow. The reason isn't ignorance. It's the psychological barrier between understanding ownership and tolerating what ownership requires. Because ownership requires accepting risk that cannot be hedged away. It requires enduring periods of uncertainty, sometimes extended periods, without the psychological cushion of a predictable paycheck. It requires the ability to hold a position under pressure, to stay committed to something that might fail, to absorb losses without abandoning the long-term orientation that gives the ownership value in the first place. None of those things are skills that employment develops. Employment develops the opposite skills, the ability to perform reliably within a defined structure, to execute without needing to understand the whole picture, to accept that the overall results are not your direct responsibility. These are genuinely useful skills in their context, but they are almost perfectly misaligned with the psychological requirements of building wealth through ownership. So when an employed person encounters an investment opportunity or a business idea, they bring an employment psychology to it. They evaluate it the way they evaluate a job, looking for safety, predictability, defined upside, limited downside. They want the opportunity to look like a salary before they'll engage with it. And most real wealth-building opportunities don't look like that. Most of them look uncertain, complex, and risky, which means the employment-conditioned mind passes on them consistently for years until the window for that particular opportunity has closed, and then they go back to work. Because work, at least, is certain. There's something worth pausing on here, the way modern society has constructed the narrative around employment. Because the messaging is not neutral. It never has been. From childhood, the path laid out in almost every educational institution, almost every parenting conversation, almost every cultural message is this: study hard, get good grades, get a good job, work your way up, save for retirement. This is presented as the responsible path, the safe path, the adult path. Notice what's absent from that narrative: ownership, independent wealth creation, financial risk-taking. The idea that you might build something of your own rather than contributing to something someone else owns. These are not part of the standard curriculum. They appear, if they appear at all, as exceptions, as stories about exceptional people who took exceptional risks and got exceptionally lucky. Not as the normal path, not as something the average person should seriously consider. Why does the curriculum look this way? Because the economy, as it currently functions, requires employees, lots of them, consistent, reliable, motivated employees who show up on time, execute within structures they didn't design, and accept that the primary financial rewards flow to owners rather than workers. That's not a conspiracy. It's simply the logical output of an economic system that was built by owners and that perpetuates itself through workers who are conditioned from childhood to accept the worker's role as natural and correct. The ideology of employment doesn't feel like ideology because it's so pervasive. It feels like common sense. It feels like reality. And that's precisely what makes it so effective. Ideology is most powerful when it's invisible, when people enforce it on themselves without recognizing they're doing so, when they experience the boundaries it creates not as external constraints, but as internal preferences, as who they are. A person says, "I'm not the kind of person who takes big risks." They believe they're describing a personality trait. They're actually, in most cases, describing the output of decades of conditioning that taught them to identify with stability and to experience risk as a form of irresponsibility. The ideology has become the self. The cage has become the identity. Here is a pattern that appears again and again in the financial trajectories of middle-class households, and it deserves to be examined with clinical precision because it's not accidental. In their 20s, people enter the workforce. The salary feels meaningful relative to their previous income, which was zero or close to it. They spend. They enjoy. They don't think much about building wealth because they're young, and wealth seems like something that comes later, gradually, with time. In their 30s, expenses multiply. Children arrive, mortgages appear. The lifestyle has expanded, the obligations have compounded, and now the salary that once felt generous is being entirely consumed by the cost of maintaining the life it built. The financial margin has disappeared, but it doesn't feel like a crisis because this is what life is supposed to look like at this stage. Everyone around them is in the same situation. Normality provides its own anesthesia. In their 40s, the calculation gets quietly terrifying for those willing to do it. The retirement accounts are growing, slowly, but not fast enough. The mortgage is large, the children are expensive, the years are passing, and the window for the kind of compounded wealth building that creates real financial freedom is narrowing, visibly. But leaving the salary now, actually stepping out of the employment structure and doing something different, carries more risk than ever, because now there are more people depending on the income, more obligations that require continuity, more that could go wrong, so they don't leave. The fear of disrupting the stability is now too well justified to argue against. There are real dependents. There are real obligations. The risk isn't abstract anymore. And so the decision to stay gets made again and again and again, each time with better and better reasons, each time with a slightly tighter grip on the structure that is simultaneously their security and their ceiling. By the time the children are grown and the obligations reduce, the conditioning is complete. The risk-taking capacity that might have existed in their 20s has atrophied through decades of non-use. The identity built around employment is too deeply established to reconstruct. The decade or two remaining before retirement isn't enough time for the compounding that creates real wealth. And so they retire, or try to, into something that looks like comfort, but feels underneath like a quiet awareness of what was never built. This is not a tragedy of character. It's the normal output of a system functioning exactly as designed. The concept of opportunity cost, what you give up by choosing one path over another, is typically discussed in purely financial terms. But there's a psychological opportunity cost to employment that's almost never quantified, and it may be the more significant of the two. Every year spent in a structured employment environment is a year in which the psychological skills required to build independent wealth are not being developed. The tolerance for uncertainty isn't being built. The ability to sit with ambiguity and keep moving isn't being practiced. The capacity to take a financial loss and reframe it as information, rather than catastrophe, isn't being trained. These aren't just financial skills. They're cognitive and emotional capacities. Like any capacity, they develop through use and atrophy through disuse. And an employment structure, by design, doesn't require them. It actively removes the situations that would require them. The employer absorbs the uncertainty, manages the downside risk, decides the strategic direction. The employee operates within a cleared, risk-managed environment. That's part of what the employer is paying for. So the employee is not just being compensated financially. They are being paid to not develop the capacities that would make them capable of not needing the employer. The employment relationship, at a deep structural level, reproduces the conditions for its own continuation. It pays people to remain employees. Understanding this doesn't make employment wrong or working for a salary a moral failure. It makes it a choice with very specific consequences. Consequences that are almost never fully articulated at the beginning, when the choice is made, when the first offer letter is signed with relief and gratitude and no awareness of what the acceptance is trading away. There's a phenomenon in behavioral economics called loss aversion. The well-documented finding that the psychological pain of losing something is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining an equivalent amount. Losing $100 feels about twice as bad as gaining $100 feels good. In the context of employment and wealth, loss aversion operates as a powerful anchor to the status quo. When a person considers leaving their job to pursue something independent, their mind doesn't evaluate the upside and downside equally. The potential loss, the salary, the stability, the certainty, registers with roughly twice the psychological weight of the potential gain. Even when the rational analysis would favor the move, the emotional calculus doesn't. The fear of losing what exists is disproportionately stronger than the desire for what could be, and this isn't a cognitive error that education or information can simply correct. It's a feature of human psychology, built through evolution, that served survival very well in environments where resources were scarce and losses were life-threatening. The problem is that in modern financial contexts, it systematically biases people toward preservation over growth, toward the known over the unknown, toward the salary over the equity, toward the employee over the owner. The person who holds a well-paying job, and consider starting a business isn't making a straightforwardly rational calculation. They're fighting a neural architecture that weights the risk of failure roughly twice as heavily as the potential of success. Most people don't win that fight, not because they're weak, but because the fight itself is deeply unequal, and nobody told them that when they took the job and let the conditioning begin. There is a way that middle-class culture perpetuates itself, that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with social belonging. The social world of the employed middle class, the friendships, the conversations, the mutual frameworks for what makes a person respectable and sensible, is organized around a particular set of values. Stability is admired. Steady career progression is respected. Responsible financial behavior means managing expenses, contributing to retirement accounts, not taking foolish risks. The person who leaves a good job to start a business is looked at initially with a mixture of admiration and concern that slowly shifts to quiet skepticism as time passes and success remains uncertain. This social environment exerts real psychological pressure. Humans are social animals. The fear of social judgment, of being seen as irresponsible, reckless, a person who abandoned a good thing and failed, is a genuine and powerful deterrent. And the social validation that comes from being seen as the person with the good job, the solid career, the steady progress, that validation is real and meaningful. It costs something to give it up, something that doesn't appear in financial calculations. What this means in practice is that the middle-class social environment creates a form of peer enforcement of the employment system. Nobody sits anyone down and says you cannot leave. Nobody punishes departure explicitly. But the social cost of departure is quietly real, and the social reward for staying is consistently available. And over years of navigating that social environment, most people internalize its values so thoroughly that they stop experiencing it as external pressure and start experiencing it as their own convictions. This is how systems sustain themselves without force. Not through coercion, but through normalization. Not by making departure impossible, but by making it feel like a betrayal of the values by which you define yourself. The most effective control is the kind that people exercise on themselves, willingly, with full conviction that they're making their own choices. Here is the central financial truth that the structure of employment makes almost impossible to see clearly. Money has two fundamentally different modes of existence. It can be earned, which means traded directly for time and labor, a linear relationship where income stops the moment the labor stops. Or it can be working, deployed in assets, businesses, investments that generate returns independent of the owner's active involvement. The difference between these two modes is not just financial, it is architectural. It is the difference between a structure that requires your continuous presence and a structure that does not. All real wealth, without exception, is built in the second mode, not through earning more, but through deploying capital in ways that generate income without proportionate labor. This is not a secret of the wealthy. It's written in every serious book about finance. But understanding it conceptually and being psychologically capable of executing it are two entirely different things, because making the transition from the first mode to the second requires tolerating a period, sometimes a long period, of uncertainty, reduced income, and real risk. It requires stepping off the treadmill that provides psychological security and onto terrain that provides no guarantees, and that transition is precisely what employment psychology is worst equipped to handle. The salary-conditioned mind can conceptualize passive income. It can admire it in others. It can plan for it in theory. But when it comes time to actually reallocate the capital, to take the salary reduction, to absorb the early losses, to hold the position through the uncomfortable uncertainty, the fear activates, the loss aversion kicks in, and the theoretical understanding evaporates into practical inaction. This is why financial literacy alone doesn't change financial outcomes for most people. The problem is not a knowledge deficit. The problem is a psychological one, and knowledge does not rewire psychology. Experience does, specifically, the experience of tolerating risk and surviving it, repeatedly, until the nervous system learns that uncertainty doesn't equal catastrophe. That experience is almost entirely absent from the employed life, and its absence is the hidden cost that no salary negotiation accounts for. There is a kind of exhaustion that accumulates in the employed life, not the exhaustion of overwork, though that's often present too, but something quieter and more disorienting. It's the exhaustion of perpetual optimization within a fixed structure, of finding better and better ways to manage a situation that, at its core, isn't changing, of getting very good at things that don't compound into something fundamentally different. This exhaustion shows up in the way people talk about money in their 40s and 50s. There's a particular quality to those conversations, a mixture of practicality and resignation that sounds like wisdom but carries something darker underneath it. When people say, "That's just how it is" about financial ceilings, when they preemptively dismiss possibilities as unrealistic, when they have deep, detailed knowledge of why things can't work before they've seriously evaluated whether they could, that's not cynicism. That's the psychological residue of years of accumulated disappointment that the mind has converted into realism to make it bearable. The mind is extraordinarily adaptive. One of its most remarkable adaptations is the capacity to reframe limitation as preference, to reinterpret constraints as choices, to transform a cage into a home. People who cannot afford the life they originally imagined very often arrive, through a sequence of small psychological adjustments, at a place where they no longer want it, where the wanting itself has been quietly extinguished because wanting, something you cannot have, is painful, and the brain is very good at eliminating pain. This is not surrender. It's survival. It's a deeply human and even beautiful mechanism. But it does mean that the financial and psychological damage of the employment trap often becomes invisible from the inside. Not because it isn't there, but because the people living it have adapted to it so thoroughly that it no longer registers as damage. It registers as life. None of this leads in the end to a simple prescription. There isn't one. Because the forces that produce this outcome, the psychological conditioning, the social reinforcement, the neurological architecture of fear, the structural design of employment, the ideology embedded in education from childhood, these are not obstacles that an insight or a decision or a new habit can simply dissolve. What they can do is become visible, and visibility matters. Not because seeing the cage immediately produces freedom, but because you cannot begin to interrogate a belief you don't know you hold, cannot begin to examine a fear you don't know is operating, cannot begin to make a genuinely conscious choice while you believe you're already making one. The financial condition of most employed people is not primarily an income problem. It is not a savings rate problem. It is not an investment knowledge problem. It is a psychological problem, one rooted in how the mind learns to relate to certainty and uncertainty, to risk and safety, to ownership and service. And that psychological condition was not chosen. It was produced gradually and systematically by a way of organizing economic life that benefits enormously from a large population of people who are capable of working hard, capable of managing their expenses, capable of planning for retirement, but not psychologically equipped to build the kind of independent wealth that would make them unnecessary to the structure that employs them. This is not a conspiracy requiring villains. It is a system producing the outcomes it was designed to produce through mechanisms so normalized they're invisible, using fear so thoroughly internalized it doesn't feel like fear at all. It feels like being responsible. It feels like being realistic. It feels like knowing how the world works. And maybe the most unsettling question, the one worth sitting with, not to produce panic but to produce clarity, is this: how much of what feels like a financial decision is actually a fear response you've never examined? How much of what feels like prudence is actually conditioning you never consented to? How much of the ceiling you're living under is made of the world's limitations, and how much is made of a psychology shaped so carefully over so many years that it has become indistinguishable from your own? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, but it might be the most important financial question you've never been asked.